So welcome to the second last class. I cannot believe that the semester is practically over already, but this is it. There's this class, and then there's one more class on Monday. Is that right? That should be right, right? So this class, and then one more class on Monday, and then your exams are next week, I believe. That sounds right to everybody? Good. Okay, so let's talk about very quickly the second written assignment. If you haven't started it yet, maybe you would like some leads, some ideas on where to start. So here's a couple of possible case studies for you. So just straight out of the science news. So this is the kind of thing that I sort of had in mind. If you pick something larger than this, that's totally fine. So I didn't have a very specific size of event in mind when I said case study. It could be this history of sociobiology, or it could be something as specific as the fact that genetically modified salmon has been sold in Canada for the first time recently. So they've got these salmon, they grow about twice as big, about twice as fast as natural grown salmon, and they've been genetically modified to do so. So this process, it's been in the approvals process for like 25 years. They've been trying to get this thing approved. So this is an interesting, to my mind, this is an interesting case of the possible interaction between science and values. So one question you might ask is, why didn't they rush this through? Like, were there legitimate reasons to sit on this for 2.5 decades? Or was that sort of contextual values interfering with science? Like, we prefer something natural to something unnatural. That's not really a scientific value, it's a sort of social value. Or is this a case where people's contextual values are actually interfering with the scientific process by like pushing something through that shouldn't have been? Like, industry wants this, maybe they're not even ready yet to have released it. So one thing that you could do is look at this case and just sort of tease out the different ways that values might be playing a role, either in preventing this from coming to market or in accelerating it towards the market. Either of those are perfectly fine. Another one, very similar, also in the genetic modification stuff, CRISPR technology, which is this brand spanking new technology for editing genes in living organisms, has been used on human embryos for the first time. If I remember the case study right, they were editing out some genes that are associated with risk of heart disease. And they used it on human embryos. I don't think the human embryos then went on to be grown into full-blown humans. They were just they tried it on the embryos to see what would happen. But here it is. They've begun to do genetic modification on human embryos. So that's something that's got values all over it, right? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? And all that stuff. So another possible case study, or you could just do something from class like the rat park studies. There's tons of stuff to say about the rat park studies. Lots of people have criticized it, so just tracing out the criticisms of the story as I presented it to you would be a good case study. Okay, so just a couple possible leads in case you haven't started yet. I hope you started. I hope you've been thinking about this already. It's the kind of thing that's much better if you do it over, the more sleeps you can get between starting and finishing it, the better, because that's where unconscious processing and digesting and synthesizing happens while you're asleep. So literally the more, if you can do like a little bit one day and then a little bit the next day and a little bit the next day, that's far better and more efficient than trying to get it all written the night before. So I hope that you've been doing that already. If you've been thinking about it, you've done most of the work. Like the thinking part is the typing part is trivial. The thinking part is the hard part. The thinking and the research, of course. So I hope you've been working on it. I hope it's going well. If you haven't started yet, here are some places you could start, potentially. Talk about the exam. So here's the structure of the exam. 10 multiple choice of the same style that you saw on the midterm. There will be 5 definitions worth 2 points each, where we want you to explain a key course term in a few sentences. My usual way of thinking about points on exams is like roughly 1 point per 1 or 2 sentences. So these definitions, if you gave me a 4-point definition, or a 4-sentence definition explaining what the term means and maybe how it's related to course ideas, that would be fully sufficient to get you the 2 marks. There'll be 2 short answer questions that expect you to write a paragraph or 2. And one of them is from the main ideas from the first half of the course. So if you want to know whether this exam is cumulative, technically it is cumulative, but it's really, I think, just one of those short answers. None of the details of the first half of the course are really on the exam. Just one of those short answers is on one of the big concepts, and then the other one is on the second half. And then there's a, yeah, question?
So there's some past exams in
Depends if they're my exam or not. The summer 2016 instance of this course was the one I ran, and it would bear a large similarity to the one this time. However, any other instance is from a different professor who would have been running quite a different exam. So yeah, only if it's that one specific one. And okay, so the essay question is as follows. Here is the one and only essay question. Feel free to prepare as much as you like. So, to what extent can our scientific understanding of human nature inform our values? This is another one of those degrees and to extent style questions. So what I'm trying to leave open for you is to say a little bit but not completely, or in this way but not in that way. So to give a mixed answer that's not coming down definitively on one side of the issue or the other. I take it that in these incredibly complex human questions, that's the kind of answer that you mostly come up with. Like if you're being serious about any of these questions, probably the answer you're going to come up with is a little bit of this, a little bit of that, not completely, but somewhat in this respect and not that respect. That's the kind of thing that historians typically say. That's, I mean, when philosophers are being serious, we say stuff like that too. We do tend to towards sweeping generalizations when probably we shouldn't, but historians are really good at this. They say, well, yes, but, and these are little details that you can add. So that's the style of answer to that I'm fishing for when I say to what extent. But if you want to edit that out mentally and just have a nice, clean, definite question, say, can our scientific understanding of human nature inform our values? Yes or no? So the to what extent is just leaving in the possibility in that question that you can answer somewhere between straightforward yes and straightforward no. Yeah? So there's only, I believe there's only one element from the first half of the semester, which is one of the short answer questions. And again, it's about one of the big issues, not the details. I believe everything else, I'll confirm that for you on Monday, but I believe everything else is from the second half of the course. Which is not to say that you can't bring stuff from the first half of the course to bear on the essay question. Please feel free to do that. Might help. Further questions about that? We can talk more about this on Wednesday. Yeah?
Is the last lecture going to be like preparation for the exam, or is it going to be class?
No, it's a class. It's content. Yeah. Yeah. It's just too short of a semester to not have it all be classes, basically. Yeah. So on Monday, we're going to talk about free will and biology. Yeah.
Is the final going to be more based on the lectures or the readings?
It's mainly based on the lectures. I think the ratio is probably about the same as on the midterm, where it's like 80 to 90% lecture material, 10 to 15% readings. Yeah. I don't know how to make the readings more serious for you. Like, some classes take the readings much more seriously and like would base 50% of the exam on the readings, on the assumption that you're spending 2 to 4 hours a week with me and then at least that much doing the readings. Like it takes at least 2 hours to do one of these readings and there's 2 a week. So yeah, we're not that focused on the readings in this class, but they are in there. You are actually supposed to be reading those things in case you're not. So yeah. Any further questions about course mechanics? So for essay advice, again, Craig is going to be marking the essays, so you can email him, or many of you have been emailing me as well. That's fine as well. You can, if you want sort of quick advice. If you email either of us 6 hours before the due date, I would not expect a speedy response. You kind of got to give us a little more lead time than that, but you know, in the next few days, if you want to email either of us, we'll try to get back to you as fast as we can. Okay? My apologies. I don't think I'll be able to be at the exam, unfortunately. I'm also teaching a class at University of Toronto, Mississauga, and they have a Makeup Monday on that day. So my final class for my other class is exactly the same time as our exam. So I'm sorry, I won't be there. I don't think I'll be there in person, unfortunately. But I'm sure you'll do fine. I'm sure it'll be fine. It should be fairly straightforward. It should be almost exactly like the midterm, basically, except longer. This is 2 hours instead of 1 hour. And to avoid confusion on my part, you should look up yourself when and where the exam is. I am not setting that, so there's no possibility I could have messed it up. So, yeah, I'll leave that at that. Okay, so if there's no further questions, and we can talk more about the exam and or the final essay on Monday, or feel free to email me if you have any further questions, okay? Okay, so the topic for today is Elizabeth Lloyd's book, or at least 2 chapters from it, The Case of the Female Orgasm. This is continuing on our project of trying to understand how, or the degree to which science can tell us about human nature, and via human nature tell us about how we should act. Because of course, to work out what you should do, one good thing to start with is to figure out what kind of thing you are. Who am I? What am I? And on that basis, you can sort of set out at least the far limits of what you should do. Because according to Kant, the sphere of things that you should do is entirely contained within the sphere of things that you can do. So this is supposed to be our philosophical justification for thinking that science might tell us a little something about what we should do. And last week, I started exploring this thought that perhaps evolution can help explain our properties, what kind of things we are, what our possibilities are like, and so help to understand ourselves. And I hope you came away from the last lecture with a kind of feeling that maybe not, that the picture wasn't all that great, right, of the past attempts to understand what kind of beings we are via evolutionary theory. Mostly it ended up being that we were seeing our own values in science because we had those values, not because the science was telling us what to value. And this lecture is going to be a bit more of the same. We're going to talk about, Lloyd is going to make the case that values are playing a bad role in science, that they're interfering with the scientific process. But in another sense, what we're looking at is a case of what Longino calls transformative criticism. So Lloyd is a scientist, and what she's trying to do is bring out the ways that values have biased the scientific process in the past so that those biases can be corrected. She's not saying give up on science, she's saying let's do better science. Let's take our biases into account, and by doing that, we can improve the scientific process. So she's trying to do what Longino calls transformative criticism, which is the thing that's supposed to keep science on the rails. So, okay, so to evolution. Broadly speaking, here's one way that you might think that you can figure out what kind of being you are. Here's a strategy that you might find tempting. So this is a tree of the primates. Here are all the primates. So this is our, evolutionarily speaking, this is our family. There we are, humans. You can see right beside us are bonobos and chimpanzees. Those are our 2 closest species to us. That's about 5 million years difference. So the last common ancestor between humans and both chimps and bonobos is about 5 million years, something like that. And gibbons, I think it's about 30 million years. Yeah, gibbons and gorillas is about 30 million years. Gibbons is a bit longer. So we're talking about distances of 5, 10, 20, 30 million years in this kind of close range. And one way that you might try to figure out what kind of being you are is just to look at your close family and say, oh, well, if some property is shared by chimps and bonobos and humans, that might be a property that was given to us by evolution, right? So that might be one strategy. Like you can do that kind of in your personal life. So both of my parents were teachers. I ended up currently as a teacher. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe that's something I inherited from my family. Seems like a fairly reasonable inference, right? The problem, and just in 1 second, I'm going to show you that I think that this is not a great inference, but it does tell us a little something about human nature, right? So the point that I'm going to try to make to you right now is that human nature is quite flexible. That if you look at the properties of our very close, even our closest, these are the closest currently existing species. There used to be closer ones like Neanderthal and Homo habilis. but they all died out. So currently, the closest living relatives that humans have are chimps and bonobos. And what we can find out from looking at the kind of society that chimps and bonobos have is that there's a huge range available to us. This is what I would argue to you. So on the left are bonobos, and on the right are chimpanzees. You can see they look pretty much the same. Like to me anyway, I'm not a primatologist. To me, the chimps and bonobos look pretty much the same. But they have quite different societies, quite different social structures. So for example, chimpanzees are highly patriarchal. So there's a male-female size difference. The males are much larger than the females on average, and the males tend to dominate everyone in the sense that they actually beat them up. So one of the rites of passage for a young chimpanzee male is to beat up all the females in the troop to show that it's physically stronger than all the females. That's how you kind of get your place on the male dominance hierarchy. So it's a quite violent society, it's quite male dominated, it's quite hierarchical, and the bonobos are about as far from that as you can get. So they are a female dominated society, and they have substantially less violence. So chimpanzees will go to war, they'll tear each other apart very happily. Bonobos have a different strategy. So they're a female dominated society where conflicts are usually resolved by casual sex, essentially. So if there's a fight in a bonobo troop, and they do fight, it's not that they live a totally peaceful, life, but when there's a fight, they will sort of rub genitals to make up afterwards. Or if, for example, a really nice fruit tree is discovered, so a tree full of fruit, and a whole bunch of bonobos swarm it, one of the things they'll do before they go eat, they will rub genitals, hetero and homosexually, and that sort of shows that, hey, we're friends, and I don't have to fight you for the fruit. Right? So what they show they use this as a kind of social handshake. So they use sex as a kind of like, hey, we're okay, diffuse the tension a little bit, and then everybody agrees that we're all cooperating, and then you can eat from the fruit tree at your leisure, rather than thinking that all of the surrounding primates are your enemies and that you have to fight them. So bonobos are a more cooperative society where sort of female solidarity has taken over the sort of social structure, and they diffuse tension by basically casual sex, and often homosexual casual sex. So males and males, females and females, they really don't care. Juveniles, adults and juveniles, they really are quite promiscuous. Chimpanzees are also quite promiscuous. Neither of these species have serious sort of monogamous bonding where they only have one sexual partner. So females and males will both have a variety of sexual partners in a chimpanzee troop. But they don't do this thing where sex is their main kind of social lubricant. They don't use sex in the same way that bonobos do to kind of diffuse tensions, to keep everybody harmonious and cooperating. Okay, so these are our closest relatives with radically different societies, radically different types of societies. About as far as the eye can see in terms of human society, right? So you can imagine a violent, top-down, patriarchal human society. You can imagine the cooperative, sexy, female-dominated society, and a whole bunch of other, those aren't, it's not just one spectrum, there's a whole bunch of dimensions on that, but these are quite different societies in our closest relatives. So, if you wanted a specific way of life to fall out of evolutionary theory, you should be disappointed, because what we have is our closest relatives having quite different ways of life. Right? So if you say, well, there's only one way of life for us, it's the natural way. It's what our closest ancestors, or closest evolutionary relatives lived like, you're just wrong, right? There's at least two very different ways. Furthermore, they don't really seem to be all that genetic. So if you take, for example, if you take a chimpanzee and raise it in a bonobo troop, it will act like a bonobo. And vice versa, I believe. So it's simply not the case that evolutionary theory or just looking at our close relatives can just tell you how to live. However, this is still information about human nature and about the space of possibilities afforded to us. I would say that this is at least evidence that these are possibilities for us. These are both possibilities for us. Neither of these are ruled out by nature. That's all Kant's law can tell you, what's ruled out. So you can say, if you can't do it, then it's not a possibility. It is not possible that you ought to do it. But at least we can say, on this basis, we have some space here, right? We have a space of possibilities that's fairly large. It's not constrained to just one way of being. Okay, so to move more specifically to Lloyd. So that was sort of broad considerations about one strategy that you might use. Let's move now to Lloyd, who's got a specific case study in this kind of like evolutionary, social, sexual development of our species. And her question is about the evolution of the female orgasm. And this book is a review, so the first half is largely a review of all of the extant explanations. So there's about 21, depending on how you count them, and she finds all of them to be terrible. She provides arguments against all 21 of them. And I mean, her arguments have been criticized. This is by no means like a completely consensus view in the literature, but everybody agrees that she at least looked at all of the available ones. And she finds them all to be unacceptably bad for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about. And what she then goes on to argue in the second half of the book is that you can detect a pattern in the errors being made. Right? There are systematic biases here. They're not just random biases. They're systematic biases in the theories that are being put forward. And there are basically two main biases that she detects. Androcentrism, which is andro is man or male. So the focusing on the male case as the normal case, assuming that males represent the average normal standard and that females are somehow a deviation from that. That's androcentrism. And adaptationism, which is less of a social value and more of a kind of paradigmatic value. Like this is a paradigm in evolutionary psychology, or sort of a way of thinking in evolutionary biology, that she wants to critique. So this is, androcentrism is more of a contextual value. Adaptationism is more of a feature of the paradigm of evolutionary biology that she wants to criticize. So they're both kind of value judgments in the context of this course, but androcentrism is more a standard value judgment. Adaptationism is more of a value judgment in the sense of what to notice in telling evolutionary stories. Okay, so this is her project. She's going to go through all of these explanations, say that they're all bad, and basically try to argue that their shared problem is that they're all trying to explain why women have orgasms in adaptive terms. They're all trying to say it's an adaptation for something, and that actually it's just a byproduct. So hers is a byproduct account. Just for example, her prime example of something that's a byproduct is male nipples. So why do men have nipples? The actual answer, the serious answer is because it's so important for women to have nipples, right? Women feed babies using their nipples, so it's incredibly crucial that they have them for our life cycle. At least it was before the invention of formula. So it's so important for women to have nipples. It's very early in the developmental process. We all start off the same in the womb and only later diverge into having differences between the sexes. So early in our developmental process, nipples form. And so men get them too. And that's it. That's the story of why men have nipples according to modern evolutionary biology, because it's so important for women to have them. And Lloyd is going to basically argue the same thing about the female orgasm. She's going to say, look, there's not actually selective pressure for women to have orgasms. There's huge selective pressure for men to have them. And then it's just kind of a byproduct that women have them as well. That's her claim. Right. Okay? Okay. So just briefly a word on adaptationism. So Lloyd thinks, and Lloyd is in the tradition of Stephen Jay Gould, who was her advisor, that people are too quick to call things evolved adaptations. So we're too quick to say, for any given feature of a person, that must have been selected by evolution for some purpose. And like the image of how genes and bodies are related that this was based on is outdated, essentially. So it used to be the case that we thought of genes as a kind of program, as a program like a computer program is a program, or like the shape of these gears is a program for keeping time, right? It's a mechanical program that really only has one output. That was the way we thought of genes kind of before we knew what genes were, like mid-20th century. And then we discovered DNA, and then we discovered how few genes we actually have. Like we thought it must be at least 100,000, and then it turned out to be something like 30,000. We found out in the mid-90s. And we continue to refine our understanding of how genes relate to bodies, and we find out that they're related in not a mechanical way. It's not like one gene for one body. It's a really complex developmental process that we go through. So our genes are these interesting, like, complex objects that have many different properties that they could instantiate and only instantiate a few of them. I think we'll talk about this more on Wednesday, but for now, the point here is just that when you call something an evolved adaptation, you're assuming that it's the result of a genetic program, essentially. You're saying there must be genes that programmed us to be like this. And it turns out that genes that program for specific features are much rarer than anybody thought they were even 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, so that's adaptationism, roughly speaking. And Lloyd thinks that we should raise the bar for what we're going to call an adaptation. So we should have more stringent standards. We should only call something an adaptation when there's evidence that selection acted on genetic variability. So a few parts to that. There has to be selection, so there has to be differential reproduction and survival in order for selection to act on. And there has to be genetics. There has to be a genetic basis for this trait. And there has to be variability in that genetic basis. So we share 99% of our DNA with all of each other, and so there's no genetic variation there for selection to act on. Selection can only act on cases where there are different genes. Okay, so that's a relatively high bar for calling something an adaptation, as we'll see. So lots and lots of these theories that came forward to try to explain why women have orgasms had no genetic explanation, right? They didn't tie it to any kind of underlying genetic mechanism. They didn't show that that mechanism was subject to selection, and they didn't show that there was variability in that. So what Lloyd's basically arguing is against her kind of field, saying, y'all are too quick to call something an adaptation. You're too quick to assign purposes to things. Not everything has to have a purpose. Like the idea that every single feature of this watch has a purpose, basically, or lots of its features. If you pick out any distinctive feature of this watch, it's probably got some thing that it was designed for, but you shouldn't think about human bodies like that. Don't think about living things like that. We're much more complex. Okay. So there are cases, Lloyd argues, really nice cases of evolutionary explanation where you can come to a really excellent story about how genes, selective pressure, and bodies are all related. And this is one of her best examples. It's called the Major Histocompatibility genes. So the histocompatibility genes are genes that underwrite our immune system, or at least part of our immune system. And they tell your body, they're sort of your body's story to itself about what's a part of you and what's a foreign invader, right? So how does your immune system decide which things to attack and encapsulate? Well, your major histocompatibility genes are your inherited sort of version of that. You can also get that acquired, but your histocompatibility genes are the genes that underwrite the part of your immune system that decides what to attack and what to leave alone. And these are really interesting genes because they're very diverse even in human populations. So we've all probably got quite different major histocompatibility genes. And that's a good thing because what you want, so if we all had the same major histocompatibility genes, it would be really easy for a pathogen to figure out how to get around them and then just sweep through the population. So variability here is extremely important, right? If different major histocompatibility genes will help you be immune to different things, and if we all had the same, it would be fairly straightforward for a new pathogen to evolve sort of a way around that and go through the entire human population. So that would be disastrous for us. So we really want diversity here. We really want a bunch of different versions of these genes. And furthermore, there's really good evidence that people can tell when somebody has different genes than you. So what you want to do as a mating strategy, suppose you're interested in reproducing with somebody, what you want to do is find somebody with different major histocompatibility genes than you have, right? So that your offspring get a nice mix, right? You don't want them to be the same as yours. You want them to have different major histocompatibility genes. We know which genes these are, so there's a clear genetic basis for this. So you can identify like what part of the genome are we talking about, which strands of DNA are we talking about. Furthermore, we can tell that there's variability. Furthermore, we know how there's selection on these things, right? Simply the fact that these things underwrite our immune systems, and our immune systems have very clear connections to like our ability to stay alive, right? So there's the selection part. And furthermore, there's excellent evidence that people actually select their mates on the basis of having different major histocompatibility genes. So the study that was done on, there's a bunch of studies on animals that show this. There's also studies done on humans where they had something like 20 or 40 men sweat into a t-shirt. So they had them on a treadmill or something. They got them all sweaty wearing a t-shirt. And they'd take that t-shirt, put it in a box, and give it to women to sniff. And the women would rate the smell. Is this an attractive smell or an ugly smell, or like a pungent, unattractive smell? Like, do you like the smell of this sweaty t-shirt or not? And women rated the sweaty t-shirt of men with different histocompatibility genes than their own to be more attractive than if they had the same major histocompatibility genes. Right? So women were at least not put off by the smell of men who had different genes than they did. That indicates that they would make a good genetic match in terms of giving your offspring a good mix of major histocompatibility genes. They've also done studies, I think, on faces, stuff like that. So, okay, so the point is that we've got, this is as good as it gets. In terms of evolutionary explanations for how we are, this is as good as it gets. We know what genes they are, we know how those genes are related to fitness, and furthermore, we know how those genes play a role in mate selection so that they actually have an effect on who's mating and who's not, and who's mating with whom, of course. So that's as good as it can get. But Lloyd's argument is that this is the exception. This is not the rule, right? So most features of us are not going to be amenable to this kind of really nice, clean, definite evolutionary explanation. Like which major histocompatibility genes you have is a very concrete feature of your biology. It's not something like, are you a generous person, or are you like, or any of the complex traits that you usually sort of associate with mate selection. And of course, there's a whole world of bad evolutionary explanations, explanations that do not meet some or any of the criteria that Lloyd just laid out. I included this chart from last time about the evolutionary psychology study by Asad Gad, where the conclusion was no work was done on the genetics of this case study. They did not try to ground it in any kind of concrete span of the DNA. The relation to fitness was unclear, not quite clarified, and little to no work was done to see if something is the product of a given culture rather than a genetic product. So that's the crucial question here. Is something a product of a culture, or is it a product of the genes? And I hope that the example of bonobos and chimps shows you that something that might seem very much like it's programmed genetically can turn out to be cultural. So like you might think that chimps are just programmed to be patriarchal and violent and all that stuff, but as it turns out, if you put them in a bonobo society, their behavior changes quite dramatically. So it matters a lot, right? Like in terms of trying to figure out what we should do with our lives. If being crappy to each other is just programmed in our DNA, then there's no point in trying to talk people out of it. There's no point in trying to convince people to be better or to reform themselves or to think hard about their behavior or their language or any of that stuff. It's pointless. If it's programmed in us, you should just invest in prisons and high walls and buy a gun, right? Like that's basically your only option is violently defending yourself if humanity is essentially and intrinsically violent. However, if we have a wide scope of biological possibilities, if we're not programmed to be a particular way, if actually many of the ways that we are are a result of our culture rather than our genetics, then all that stuff does make sense. You can talk people into being better people. You can discuss things. You can change people's minds. You can alter behavior through cultural means. So it matters a lot. It matters a whole lot whether something is programmed into us or whether it's something that's optional in a biological sense. I would submit to you. And the danger here, and the danger of adaptationism, as Lloyd tries to establish it, is that people are going really quickly to, this is programmed by evolution, right? We see a feature of us and it makes sense in an evolutionary context. You say, I can kind of see how this might be related to fitness, to the ability to leave fertile offspring. Therefore, it's just programmed in us. It's just an evolutionarily adapted response, and there's no point in trying to talk anybody out of it or into it or any of that stuff. Okay, so that's our main concern, I would say. So in terms of Lloyd talking about evolutionary explanations, she wants to set some just really basic minimum standards for how your explanation should be, so that it should fit the data. That sounds trivial, but as we'll see, it's not always the case, that people offer evolutionary explanations that simply don't match how people actually behave. So that's a problem, obviously. Your explanations should cohere with themselves. A couple of the models that she looks at just are blatantly incoherent. I haven't included them because they didn't make any sense. I've only included the ones that made at least a little bit of sense, but she looks at some that are just flatly incoherent. There should be some evidence for a genetic basis for the trait. Right? You should have some notion of how this thing that you're arguing is an adaptation is given to us by biology. And the explanation should connect the trait to increased fitness. So if you're going to call something an evolved adaptation, these are the kind of minimum standards that Lloyd wants to set. And we'll see that a lot of the explanations that are put forward don't meet one or more of these minimum standards. You might wonder, why are we trying to explain this at all? Some people find it uncomfortable, the idea that this would be something that you would explain, like, get your explanations off of me kind of thing. So there's a fairly clear, here's the logic though. So it's a fairly clear evolutionary explanation for male orgasms. If nobody told you, that's how babies get made. A man has an orgasm, near enough to a woman that he fertilizes her, and that's it. So if men don't have orgasms, or at least ejaculate, you don't get to reproduce. So that's as straight a line from one thing to your reproductive success as you can possibly draw. And the mystery for people was, where's the straight line from female orgasms to reproductive success? It just was not clear. Furthermore, not all primates, primates are kind of our close family evolutionarily speaking, not all primates have this. So all primate males ejaculate, not all primate females seem to have an orgasm response, or something that's analogous to what we would call the orgasm response. So it doesn't seem to be, strictly speaking, necessary for at least primates to reproduce. Right? So the question is then raised. Why? Why does it exist, and why does it exist in the form that it does? Right. I'll just go through some basic facts about the female orgasm because they're relevant. And I mean, please don't take this as basic sex act. I'm sure you know this stuff, but it's useful to keep in mind these facts because these are the facts, these are the basic data against which Lloyd is going to judge the proposed theories and find them wanting. So here's straight from the book. So it involves a sensory motor reflex, including clonic contractions, spasm of the pelvic and genital muscle groups, combination of waves of very pleasurable sensation, mounting of tensions, culminating in a fantastic sensation, and release of tension. That's the basic thing. By the way, this is just an aside on this picture. If you haven't seen this, this is the 3D structure of the clitoris. And I hadn't seen this until a couple of years ago. This is the part that you're probably familiar with, but it goes all the way around the vaginal opening and has these extensions out. It's quite interesting, and people didn't quite have this picture of this 3D structure until fairly recently. Anyway. So the female orgasm is a classic reflex. It's a classic reflex in the sense that it's involuntary. or only very semi-voluntary. It's highly prevalent across cultures. So as far as I know, there aren't any cultures that aren't like aware of the existence of this. And if they repress the existence of it by not telling anybody, women will discover it for themselves. So it's not like you have to be told that it exists and then you can experience it. It seems to be built in the same way that like a choking reflex is built in. Nobody has to tell you to choke on your food and to cough it up. You'll just do that spontaneously. But it's also highly variable within the life of individuals and in populations. So this variability is something that Lloyd's going to focus on as a really important feature of this trait. So this is the latest data. Lloyd gives a whole bunch of collected data. Here's the latest data that I could find from 2011. So how often do you orgasm during intercourse? And during intercourse is the important thing. So while having, by intercourse, I think they mean penis and vagina sex. And you can see that it's quite a spread here, right? So 15 to 20% say never. They never have orgasms during actual intercourse, like during penis and vagina intercourse. To like a substantial, like most of the population here is somewhere between rarely and only usually. And very, very few are in the almost or always or almost always category. So one of the interesting features of this is, there's a substantial portion that never have orgasms during the act that would result in babies, which is the thing that people sort of focused on in terms of the reproductive value of having orgasms, right? So with male orgasms, like it's the making of the baby that makes it reproductively relevant. Here, the baby making act seems to be only extremely weakly correlated, if correlated at all, with the reflex in women. And compare that to how often do you have an orgasm during masturbation? Now that's a very different curve, right? So far, far more women are reporting that they always have orgasms during masturbation. Still a substantial portion saying never, right? So it's not the case that all women always have orgasms during masturbation, but far, far more than during intercourse. So this is what Lloyd calls the orgasm intercourse gap. That is, if you think that the evolutionary explanation for women having orgasms is that it causes them to perform intercourse, it doesn't really look that way because there's far more efficient ways for women to have orgasms than to have intercourse. And just as a kind of aside, here's a quote from these charts are from this Zietsch study. And interestingly, so I'll just read this out. Analyzing a community sample of 2,914 Australian female twins, we found mostly near zero correlation between orgasm rates during intercourse, other sexual activities, masturbation, and a range of 19 other traits, including socioeconomic, sexual, personality, health traits, relationship length, status, extraversion, neuroticism, psychoticism, lifetime number of sex partners, preference for committed versus uncommitted sexual relations, risky sexual behavior, sexual fantasy, liberalism, conservatism, restrictive attitudes towards sex, libido, educational attainment, occupational status, and others. Okay, so the point of that is just that, so partly this is good news for people trying to explain orgasms in evolutionary and adaptive terms, right? So if you're saying, if your explanation of this chart is, and people have said this, modern women are uptight and conservative, that's why they're not having orgasms. Well, that doesn't survive a brush with the facts. Actually, it seems like, so the fact that there are huge number of women rarely or never having orgasms during intercourse seems to be almost completely unrelated to pretty much anything that you can think about the personalities of these women. You have lots of sexual partners, they could be very liberal, they could be very extroverted, all of this stuff, and still there's lots of women in this rarely or never case. I think something like 5 to 10% of women have never had an orgasm in their entire lives. And that's just a fact about us. It's a robust statistical fact about humans, right? And this is tricky to explain. If your story says there's some really crucial evolutionary reason why women have to have orgasms, it's hard to explain why regardless of their social status, their personality type, their socioeconomic situation, there's so many women not having orgasms. It's really hard to square that with the idea that this is just some absolutely essential adapted response. Okay, so these are just basic facts. So what that was meant to show is intromission. That is, if you want to have a broader or some more specific term than intercourse. Intercourse could mean a lot of things, but intromission, specifically a penis in a vagina, is not the best way for women to have orgasms. That much is clear. Furthermore, it seems to take a lot longer than male orgasms. This is one of the robust results from the sexology research. And furthermore, women don't have to stop after one, right? So men, generally speaking, once you've had one orgasm, you're sleepy and done. Women, on average, and again, these are averages, not facts about all women, but on average, women are more energized after an orgasm, they're less sleepy, they're more awake and aware. So the opposite of the male response, which it'll come up again later. Okay? Lloyd flags, and I think we should flag, a number of problems with these data. That is, amongst which are many of these studies are old, so a lot of this research comes from the 50s and 60s when we weren't as good at science, frankly. People have been getting better and better at science every year, figuring out more and more things that need to be controlled for, need to be taken into account, and so old studies just aren't as reliable as new studies on that basis. Furthermore, self-reports are notoriously unreliable, and tons of this data is based on self-reports. You can't study people in their homes without their knowledge. That's not allowed at all. So mostly what these are based on is asking people questions. And here's a fact about self-reports. So Lewinton 2001 reports, heterosexual men report 75% more sexual partners on average than heterosexual women. But what do you know has to be the same, or has to be the case about those two numbers? I spilled it. They have to be the same. The average number of heterosexual partners for men and the average number of heterosexual partners for women in a population have to be the same number, right? And yes, they have taken into account the possibilities that there are a few extremely promiscuous individuals, like sex workers or something like that. They've taken that into account, and they still know those have to be very close to the same numbers. And men are reporting 75% more sexual partners, heterosexual men, 75% more partners than heterosexual women are. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at data from self-report studies. Keep that fun little fact in mind, because self-reports tell you a lot about what people are willing to tell you about themselves, and maybe less about the facts. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but basic statistics tell you that those numbers have to be the same for a given population. So this data is not the best. I mean, if I had to pick a data set to base my life around, I would go to CERN and ask the particle physicists for some of their nice, Six Sigma data. This stuff is not as great. However, Lloyd wants to insist, and I think it's a reasonable point to make, that if you're going to advance a scientific hypothesis, it has to be congruent with the data that's available, right? You can't just say, well, I don't like this data, I'm just going to ignore it. You have to at least take into account the data that you have on the table and try to be coherent with that, even if it's not the best data that you could possibly want. Okay, so the second half, we're basically just going to go through a handful of these 21 evolutionary explanations, talk about the problems that Lloyd found with them, and then talk about the broader kind of philosophical context. So here are just a sample of the kinds of explanations that people have given for why human women in general are capable of experiencing orgasm. So Desmond Morris is one of these kindly old science popularizers. I like this guy, but he's wrong about a lot of stuff. So Desmond Morris says, orgasms cause women to become attached to one particular male, and that mate secures resources for the female. Right? So this is a pair bond account. So it's kind of nice, right? The reason why women experience orgasms is to cause them to fall more deeply in love with their one true primate, and become attached to them, and they secure resources for their kids, and so on. So Lloyd's problem with this is that Morris's account works only if there's a differential rate of female orgasm within and outside of the pair bond. So what this means is, so recall that in bonobos and chimpanzees, I think there is some pair bonding. It's not like they don't become attached to each other as individuals, but they have sex widely within the troop. They're not sexually monogamous by any means. So distinguish pair bonding, like getting attached to one other primate, and sexual monogamy, which is only ever having sex with one other primate. And Morris's account works only in the case that females experience more frequent orgasms within the pair bond than outside of the pair bond. And there's just not any evidence for that. Right? So if new partners are more exciting and therefore more likely to generate orgasms, then the direction of selection would go exactly opposite to what Morris said. Right? I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying if that was the case, then this would be completely wrong. And furthermore, Morris does not provide us any evidence that women have more orgasms inside a pair bond than outside. So again, it's making suppositions about the features of the phenomenon to be explained without actually supporting them with any data. Also, this is a picture of gibbons, a fairly close relative. They mate for life. They have these lifelong pair bonds, but the females do not appear to have the orgasm reflex. So it doesn't seem to be necessary, at least. This is a piece of it's not a sort of knockdown of the theory. It's a piece of disconfirming data, though, right? So if somehow orgasms are meant to secure pair bonds, then why don't they appear in gibbons? They don't. Okay. So pair bonding account. There's also, I think, serious questions about the social organization of humans in the kind of the history of our selection. So Morris's pair bond account, I would argue, kind of pictures a nuclear family, right? Like they picture one ancient human male and one ancient human female trying to make it alone on presumably the African savanna. And that's by any account, like any hunter-gatherer society that we're aware of, any evidence that we have about early humans suggests that we lived in large groups that shared resources amongst a large group. It wasn't just like, you know, dad goes out and kills a boar and drags it home for mom and kids, where the resources that you collect are entirely within a pair bond and the kids. Like that's how we do it in kind of like 1950s North America, where your resources are your own, they're shared only amongst a nuclear family, and anybody outside of that doesn't get access to those resources. As far as we can tell, anything that we can find about, or any data that we have that could be used to make inferences about the history of humanity suggests that we didn't live like that. We lived in large groups of like 50 to 150, something like that. So this looks to me like a case of, and I think Lloyd makes some of this case, looks to me like a case of people making assumptions about how society was organized 100,000, 200,000 years ago, and sort of projecting the way we live back onto the past. Right. More Desmond Morris, he's lovely. He makes up these lovely little stories with almost no basis in reality. So orgasm induces women to stay still after intercourse, increasing the chances of conception. So if you're lying down, sperm doesn't leak out of you, therefore you're more likely to get pregnant. The problem is that women don't need to stop after just one orgasm, as we talked about in these sort of basic facts about the female orgasm. What research exists on this question suggests women feel more active after orgasm, not less. Furthermore, I mean, just a couple of other points that you could raise at this point, like, so the men have a shorter time to reach orgasm during intercourse, and then they're done. And now the woman has either had one orgasm or none, and she's feeling active and awake. Do you think that makes her more likely to hang out with her man, or more likely to go find somebody else? Especially you're living in a society, if you're in a chimp or bonobo society, it's kind of normal for you to go have sex with multiple people in a day. Like that's not at all uncommon for our closest evolutionary partners or family members. So the idea that an orgasm will induce a female to be still, calm, and dedicated to her pair bond just doesn't seem to fit the data that we have available. Okay. Here's another, so there's a variety of those pair bond accounts that face a variety of problems. Here's another type of account, mate selection accounts. So Allen and Lemon argue that female orgasm acts as a mechanism of mate selection. Right? So that is to say, so this takes into account at least some of the differential, so the fact that women don't always have orgasms. So this is if a mate is able to produce an orgasm for you, or with you, then it's a kind of signal to you that this is a high quality mate. Aha, this is a good simian for you to be with, right? So if you're, the idea is that you're more excited, more interested in a better quality, so however you're perceiving the quality of your mate, you'll be more likely to have an orgasm, and that's a kind of signal to you to say, stick to this one. This one's good. The problem with this, Lloyd points out, is the orgasm intercourse discrepancy. So Allen and Lemon make this weird assumption that women used to have way more orgasms or used to have them way faster, way easier. That they assume that men and women used to have orgasms at the same rate. Not for any scientific reason, in the sense of having data to support that view. They're just like, well, this would make sense. And then society has dampened down a sort of like, social oppression of women has dampened down their capacity to have orgasms. And that's why it's different now. But again, the data that I showed you from 2011 suggests that it's very unrelated. Your capacity to have orgasms is very unrelated to your life circumstances. So this doesn't seem to make sense either. Okay, I'm just going to whip through these because they're very weird. So in the same vein, so one of the subsection of mate selection accounts are sperm competition accounts. So these rely on what's charmingly called the Upsuck Hypothesis. That is, the contractions typical of an orgasm help move sperm into the uterus. So maybe you've had multiple sexual partners in a day. The one that you have an orgasm with, this theory goes, is the one that is more likely to have their sperm moved up into the uterus and therefore to fertilize you. So orgasm therefore acts as a means of female choice, which if you recall from the last lecture was one of the sort of cornerstones of what's called the sexual selection theory, that women are choosy and their choosiness is one of the things that moves the species forward. So orgasm acts as a means of female choice, and she'll have orgasms with high quality males, whatever that means to you as a primate, but not low quality males, thus increasing her likelihood of providing her offspring with good genes. She also gets the benefits of extra pair mating without the burden of always having to reproduce. So she can, the female can mate with a bunch of males, and this does a couple of things. It might make them better disposed towards her to share resources. It also muddies the question of paternity. So I think I mentioned last time with, not bonobos, I can't remember the name of the primate now. So with some primates, it's the case that a male will kill offspring that aren't its, or his, I suppose. And one of the things that having multiple sexual partners in quick succession does is make it unclear to each of them who the father is. So you're less likely to kill the offspring to weed out competition to your own offspring if you don't know who the father is. So two reasons why you might want to have a bunch of copulations, but only want to get fertilized by certain males. Isn't that a great story? It's a great story. The problem is that there's absolutely no evidence for upsuck. Just doesn't seem to be the case. And some very brave volunteers proved this, or at least showed that in I think it was a PET study, the positron emission tomography study. So what they did was they got into a scanner, had radioactive goo inserted into their vaginas, and then masturbated themselves to orgasm. So there's this radioactive dye, roughly the consistency of ejaculate, and then they, in this really weird environment, managed to have an orgasm while being scanned, and they watched where the stuff went. And there was no relation. It did not get sucked up into the uterus. So when they watched to see if upsuck actually happens, it doesn't. as far as anyone can tell. So once again, a perfectly good evolutionary story ruined by facts. It's too bad. It was a nice story, right? But turns out the mechanism that underwrites it just doesn't exist. Too bad for Upsuck. Okay. There's another kind of broad class of accounts we might call behavioral reinforcement accounts. So Diamond and Hurdy argue that, so these two at least include the fact that women don't always have orgasms in their account. Actually, they base their account on that fact. So what they say is intermittent reinforcement provided by the variability of female orgasm motivates them to copulate more, securing more resources and protection. So I put a slot machine up here. So if you, one of the things that we learned from torturing rats for the 20th century was that if you give somebody a reward every time they do an action, and then one time stop giving them a reward, they'll very quickly stop doing the action. You press a lever, you get some food, press a lever, you get some food, press a lever, you don't get food, you give up pretty quick. But if you only give them food one every 5 times they press the lever, then they'll keep pressing it long after you stop getting food, right? So intermittent reinforcement, only reinforcing the behavior some of the time, causes people to engage in the behavior much more. No doubt the people who design the video games that you play know this, and so they'll only reward you some of the time when you do the thing. And so the argument is that orgasms are like this. This is why the orgasms are variable. It's to induce women to copulate more. So some problems that Lloyd points out, this doesn't work at all on the 5 to 10% of women who never have orgasms. And it doesn't work at all on the substantially larger population that rarely or never have orgasms during intercourse, right? Like, there's a huge difference between like the physical capacity to have orgasm and having orgasms regularly during intercourse. And this sort of assumes that that difference doesn't really exist, and it does. I would just point out also that we already copulate way more than we need for the purposes of reproduction. So like, when you're thinking about fitness, so fitness is your ability to leave offspring that are likely to leave offspring, or to support people who are leaving offspring that are related to you that are likely to leave offspring. But the number of times humans copulate on average compared to the number of times we reproduce is way, way bigger already. It's like 200 to 1 or something like that. So like, it's not obvious to me that more copulation actually increases human fitness. Right? Copulation is not the bottleneck. Like, the number of times we have sex is not the bottleneck for our reproductive success. If you're living in a hunter-gatherer society, the bottleneck is getting enough food. Right? So it doesn't matter how many times you copulate if you can only get a certain amount of food out of your environment. Right? You can only support so many kids no matter how many times you have sex. So that's not the bottleneck. That's not the thing that's going to change your reproductive success or your fitness success. All right, so okay, that was a whirlwind tour through just a handful of her accounts. She does a bunch more. I won't belabor the point. I won't sort of like go through them tediously one by one. But I'd like to sort of contrast this with Lloyd's account. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Why do all these accounts make the assumption that a male would mate with any female?
Why do all these accounts assume that the male will mate with any female? So I don't want to speak for every one of these researchers on why they would assume that. It's an extremely common assumption built into what's called the sexual selection framework. So the sexual selection framework comes straight out of Darwin, like good old 1850s Victorian society, and it assumes that men are promiscuous and women are coy. So men will have sex with anyone because it's such a low biological investment for us. Like, one ejaculate is not that many calories, right? And you can just leave after, like if you just impregnate somebody and leave. So you have a very low minimum commitment with very high opportunity for getting your genes into the next generation. And for women, you have to go through the whole pregnancy process and like raise the thing. Like, your commitment is much, much higher. So just that is taken to entail that men should be willing to have sex with anyone, basically, and women should be much more choosy. Yeah?
But then shouldn't all these accounts be false? Because that's clearly
That's one of the reasons that Lloyd thinks that these are false. Yeah. So Lloyd's arguing against these on a variety of bases. It's not clear to me that these all assume that. Like so for example, the pair bond accounts talk about men in kind of long-term, relatively monogamish pair bonds. So that's one where one male is trying to secure a female he's confident about the paternity of the children that in the pair bond. So he's trying to like keep other males from mating with her, so that he knows that the children are his, so that he can invest resources in them in the confidence that he's raising his own children, kind of thing. So that would be. I don't think that that's very strongly assumed by Morris's pair bond account, but it is a very prevalent assumption in the literature, and it's I don't know. Why do they assume that? I guess that's a question more about the psychology of these people than about the science here. So I don't want to speculate too much, but yeah.
And one more thing: are they arguing that an orgasm leads to reproduction, or having more orgasms leads you to be more likely to reproduce?
So it's different for the different accounts. So whether they think that orgasms are directly related to reproduction or indirectly related. So the ones where for Diamond and Hurdy, you're motivating women to copulate more and therefore be more likely to get pregnant. So that's a sort of direct link. Whereas in the pair bond accounts, the link is less direct. It's less about the actual act of sex and more about the sort of social surrounding, how dedicated you are to the partner, how likely you are to stick with them, and that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yeah, so Lloyd is definitely not presenting these as great accounts that you should believe. She's presenting these for the purposes of critique, and she thinks that a lot of assumptions are being made here about the history of human society and the relationship between men and women, how people are disposed to act, and all that stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly not the case that men will just have sex with anybody. It's clearly false. Okay. So that brings us to Lloyd's byproduct account. So she's arguing that all of these were stories about why the female orgasm is adaptive, that is, why it was specifically selected for. And what she wants to point out is that not every feature of us is specifically selected for. And I already mentioned male nipples. Why do men have nipples? Well, not because they were the product of evolutionary selection, right, of natural selection. It's a developmental byproduct, right? So there's a really complex developmental process that starts off with an egg and a sperm getting together, and that process has a bunch of features that have an influence on both sexes. And having nipples is so important for reproducing females that men get it as a byproduct. Similarly, it could be the case that having orgasms is so important for reproducing males that women get it as a byproduct. My other favorite example, guys, you know that ridge that runs down the middle of your ball sack? There's a ridge or like a dark line that runs down the middle of your ball sack. That is where your pre-vagina was in the womb. So we all start off as kind of like neither clearly male nor female for the first couple of weeks, and then it's only after that that a flush of hormones kind of like differentiates us. So the thing that I don't want to call it a vagina because it's not yet a vagina, but it's the fold and opening that in women will develop into a vagina, and in men it gets sealed over. So the fusion point of where that came together is that ridge that runs down the middle of your ball sack. So I recommend that next time you go to the bathroom, you visit your long lost vagina. Right, but if you ask, so what's the evolutionary purpose of this ridge down my ball sack? There is none. That's not something that nature selected for. It's not something that nature said, you must have this ridge for some reason. It's just a byproduct of the developmental process that made you an adult. Yeah? Okay, and that's her basic idea, that orgasms are like this. Female orgasms are like this. It's a byproduct. Therefore, it's not an adaptation, it's a process of development, or it's a product of development. I want to sort of like even step back from Lloyd a little bit and complement this with a new thesis on this. So in 2016, a new paper was published on, so the discussion continues on the evolutionary biology of the female orgasm. This kind of fits with Lloyd's thing, actually. So this is it's a nice bit of evolutionary context. So Mihaela and Wagner argue that female orgasm used to have a function of stimulating ovulation, but it lost that function. And what they argue is that looking just at primates is too narrow. Right? You can't just look at primates. So forget evolutionary psychologists that want to look at the last 50,000 years or 100,000 years. Forget looking at just primates the last 5 million, 10 million, 30 million years. We have to go way, way further back in the history of mammals. So rabbits, for instance, famous for their mating, have what's called induced ovulation. So a rabbit does not release an egg unless she is copulating with a male or at least near a male. Right? So unlike humans who release eggs on this monthly cycle, whether there's dudes around or not, right? We have a timed ovulation cycle. Rabbits and earlier mammals had induced ovulation. Ovulation was induced by copulation. Right? So that was the original situation for mammals. So we evolved from somebody like that. Right? So the point of, and they have an orgasm-like reflex stimulated by stimulation of the clitoris, which in rabbits is inside the vagina. In humans, it's displaced from the vagina. Right? So one of the reasons for the intercourse orgasm gap is that the clitoris, the thing that's mainly responsible for inducing orgasm, or largely, has been moved away from the intercourse process. In rabbits, it's inside, right? And it's like a button that says, okay, now would be a good time to release an egg. Yeah? So this used to be the case for mammals. And their argument is that, so it used to have this very clear and reproductively related function. Exactly like male orgasm has a straight line connection to reproduction, female orgasm in mammals, 30, 40 million years ago had a straight line connection to reproduction. And then, for whatever reason, for probably incredibly complex reasons, a bunch of mammals started having this timed release. And in other primates, like in bonobos and in chimps, that involves estrus. So there's physical, visible signs on the body that the female is either just released an egg or about to release an egg. So when you're in the fertile phase, there's kind of like estrus was like, I think their butts swell up. And if they want to indicate their fertility to a male, they like show them their butt. So we don't do that anymore. So we have hidden estrus, or we don't have like visible signs of fertility, but we nonetheless have this regular ovulation cycle. So the argument here is essentially, it's complementary to what Lloyd's saying. He's saying, look, this used to have a function millions of years ago, and then it lost that function because we switched to timed ovulation, and now it's free to acquire new functions. Right? So it could be the case that, it's perfectly compatible with Lloyd. It's actually compatible with a bunch of the other accounts. So it could be the case that there are adaptive consequences for women having orgasms, right? It has not been established here, and I don't think that I've given you an argument that there's no evolutionary consequences of women having orgasms, that it has no relation to pair bonding, it has no relation to copulation, it has no relation to any of these things that are important for our reproductive process. But this sets up a framework in which it could be a bunch of those things all at once. Right? It could be a bunch of overlapping, subtle, complicated effects all interacting, right, depending on the specific social circumstances that we found ourselves in. It could be like any number of different things all acting on this feature of us that was sort of freed up. Right? So it used to have a function, it lost that function, and then it becomes free to acquire new functions. And this is part of the really complex story about adaptation, which is that it's not always just adaptations building on adaptation. Sometimes biology finds new purposes for old features. So, which brings us to the adaptationism debate. So we sort of shifted out of the social sphere, and now we're into sort of the more scientific sort of paradigm side of things. There's this long debate that's been going on since the 70s. It's important in this context, which is about the degree to which we can interpret ourselves as the products of adaptation, of products of natural selection, or the degree to which we have to take into account things like what I just described is called exaptation. So when the body has a feature that then loses its function and acquires a new function. That's exaptation. So a couple of really famous people, there's tons and tons of people in this debate, but here's a couple of the really famous ones, sort of the most famous one. So Stephen Jay Gould, who was the advisor to Lloyd, is arguing that we're way too quick to attribute adaptations to things. And then on the other side, there's guys like Richard Dawkins, who argues that no, everything can be interpreted as an adaptation. Like the adaptive strategy of explanation is pretty much always available, or it's almost always a good thing, or at least that we haven't overdone it. So the structure of the debate is like this. Right? So really famous paper by Gould and Lewontin, 1979, The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm. So their argument is just what I've been saying. Their argument is just people are just way too quick. They find it way too easy to go from here's a regular feature of an organism to that must be an adaptation. And the spandrels of San Marco thing is a reference to these things. So spandrels, these sort of, when there's an arch, when you have a bunch of arches, you get these things between the arches called spandrels. And what they have you imagine is that somebody walks into the Cathedral of San Marco and looks at all the really elaborately decorated spandrels and said, how clever of the designer of this place to have included these spandrels for design purposes. What a lovely addition. What a lovely design feature. Now, they would have made a mistake because the spandrels are not something that you include for the sake of having spandrels. The spandrels are a byproduct of the architecturally necessary arches. So the arches are structurally strong. You need strong walls to keep up a cathedral. So what they built was arches. And when you have a bunch of arches side by side, you get as a byproduct spandrels. So somebody who walked into the Cathedral of San Marco and said, how clever to have included spandrels, would have got the story backwards. Right? They would have looked at a feature that's a byproduct of something that was designed and treated it as though it was itself designed. And their argument here is not that it's wrong to say that things are designed by natural selection or that nothing is an adaptation, just that people were way too quick to jump to the idea that if there's a regular feature of a living thing, it must be the product of selection. And just their request was just dial it back a little. Just like be a little bit responsible, be a little bit more careful to match your claims to the evidence available, and try to really support the idea. Consider that something might be a spandrel before you start saying that it was designed. That was the basic argument. So, if something is not the product of natural selection, are there other ways to explain it in evolutionary terms? What else explains in evolution? So I've already talked just very briefly about exaptation. For example, another example of exaptation is the human appendix. The appendix used to be for dealing with things like eating really rough stuff like bark and whatever. When we had a different diet, the appendix was an organ, a large organ that was necessary to digest the food that we're eating. Currently, it doesn't do that. Currently, the appendix is what's called a vestigial organ, right? It's left over from a previous body plan that we used to have. However, it turns out it's actually still useful. Currently, the appendix serves as a really nice little reservoir of gut bacteria. So you need a diverse sort of set of gut bacteria in order to properly digest food, and actually it turns out to regulate your emotions and all kinds of other things. So you need a rich gut flora, they call it. And if you happen to have diarrhea, which is one of the things that kills tons of humans, kills probably more humans than anything, including war. So if you have diarrhea, one of the things that happens is your gut flora get sort of washed out. So the appendix now serves this really nice function. It wasn't designed originally for this function. It acquired it later of being a little hiding place for your gut flora to like, it's like a fallout shelter for them to hide in while you're having diarrhea, and then they can come back out and recolonize your gut once the diarrhea is passed. So it's an exaptation. It's not that the appendix was adapted for that purpose exactly, or not originally. It had a different purpose, it lost that purpose, and then it acquired this new one. Other things include genetic drift or founder effects. So genetic drift is just the fact that mutations are, generally speaking, random. So you just acquire some things randomly. And if you combine that with what's called founder effects, then you can have really strong biases in evolution that aren't based on natural selection. So for example, you have a big population, lots of variation in it, and almost all of it dies except for one little pocket. And that one little pocket happened to have some feature, and then they re-expand and take over. Now the whole population has that feature. Not because it was a good feature, but it just happened to have only the people that happened to survive had it, and therefore now it takes over the population. So the explanation of that is not natural selection, it's founder effects. And humans have gone through a few of these bottlenecks recently, actually. In the last couple million years, I think, we've been down to like 10,000, something in that range, like really small populations at some point. So there's developmental constraints. So there are some things that are easier for development to get to than others. There's things like pleiotropy, which is single genes having multiple effects. So it could be the case that there are genes that underwrite women's capacity to have orgasms that are also related to other crucially important features of their physiology. Right? So selection is acting on those specific genes, but not with respect to orgasms, with respect to who knows what, the structure of your pelvis, because as it turns out, genes typically do not have one effect. It's really uncommon for one gene to only have one effect on your physiology. Actually, the emerging picture of how the genome relates to our bodies is that most genes affect most traits, which is really inconvenient, actually. It would have been super convenient if one gene just had one effect and then you could just sort of like pick and choose which genes you wanted, but that turns out to be not at all how it works. So pleiotropy is the rule, not the exception. So it could easily be the case that something is selected, a certain gene is selected for one really important effect over here, but it has as a byproduct another effect over here. Phenotypic plasticity is another one. So just the fact that, so your phenotype is just your body. So which body do your genes build? And I'm happy to tell you that your genes can build a whole bunch of different bodies. And which body it builds depends on your environment. So it's not the case that your genes just code for one body. Lots and lots of, and your body's really good at using your genes to build lots of different body types according to the environment it finds itself in. So you're not just programmed by your DNA. The metaphor is something like, instead of having a program with 30,000 lines of code, what you have is a pipe organ with 30,000 keys on it. And you can play lots of different tunes with that pipe organ. I think I'll come back to that on Wednesday. And of course, cultural inheritance in complex animals like chimps and bonobos and primates and us, where it's not the case that it's a genetic inheritance, it's a cultural inheritance. It's another thing that can explain features. Okay, so all of these are potential other means of explaining features of us, even very regular, seemingly programmed biological features of us that aren't adaptation. The adaptationists have this response. I mean, this is Dennett, who's like, if Dawkins is like a drunk guy in a bar, Dennett is his sober friend trying to like keep him out of trouble. So Dennett says, the thesis that every property of every feature of everything in the living world is an adaptation is not a thesis anybody's ever taken seriously or implied by what anybody has taken seriously, as far as I know. So his response is just like, no, we didn't think everything is an adaptation. We just thought it's always a good idea to look for adaptations, something like this. Okay. So back to female orgasms. So Lloyd's claim is not that they are not adaptive. Right? She's not saying, I have proved once and for all that female orgasms have no adaptive effects, what she's saying is we don't have enough evidence, that none of the theories currently on the table give us sufficient evidence to seriously say this is what they were adapted for. And the fact that people have been so willing to accept such weak explanations is, to her, evidence of bias. And so if those theories all seem really weak to you, I mean, partly it's because I was presenting them to you in a weak way, but she thinks that it's evidence that actually the process is biased. And she identifies, as I said before, two main biases. So androcentrism is one of them. That is the tendency to assume that men are the normal case. And this is exemplified, for example, by clinical trials done only on men. Lots of clinical trials will just take a purely male population and then say, well, men are probably normal. Men are probably the normal case. We can extrapolate to all humans from that. And in the more specific context, Morris's claim that orgasms will make women stay still. So he says the thing about, it makes you more likely to lie still and therefore get pregnant. That's just taking what's totally transparent to Morris, a dude. It's like, I know what orgasms are like. They make me want to lie still. And I'm just going to, take that thing that's totally obvious to me and apply it to women. Assume that my case is the normal case and that it can be you can extrapolate to everybody. So this is androcentrism. She traces it out in a number of different ways throughout these theories. There's more detail to her argument than I presented to you because I haven't presented all of the 21 different cases, but that's the most typical example I could think of. Okay. And of course, adaptationism I've always done. So just briefly, what she wants to argue is that there are ideologies in play here, and ideologies in a very specific sense. So the philosopher Donald Rumsfeld said in the run-up to the Second Iraq War, the Second American-Iraq War, the following. He said the following. There are known knowns. There are things that we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know that we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things that we do not know that we do not know. In this context, he's not a philosopher, he's the Secretary of Defense, I believe, at the time, and what he was arguing was we should totally invade Iraq because there are unknown unknowns. Maybe they have nukes or something, we just don't know about it. That's why we should go invade this country. So there are known knowns, things that you know that you know. There are known unknowns, things that you know that you don't know. And there are unknown unknowns, things that we don't know that we don't know. And then ideology, claims this guy, Slavoj Žižek, is precisely the fourth thing that's missing. There's a fourth element, right? Things that you know that you don't know that you know. Right? That's the proper notion of ideology here, so Morris just knew that orgasms make you sleepy. He knew it. He didn't know that he knew that. The features of your world that should count as ideology, according to this way of thinking, are those features that are unconscious assumptions that you bring to bear. They're the frame that you cannot see, right? The framework through which you see the world that you cannot see itself. Things that you know, but you don't know that you know them. And what Lloyd is arguing is that if you look at the structure of these theories, you can see the influence of ideology. Adaptationism as an ideology, as an unknown known, and androcentrism as an unknown known, and that both of these ideological commitments were contaminating the scientific research process, right? They were biasing the kind of theories that people came up with, and they were causing people to accept theories that they really shouldn't have, that they really should have known better. Just look at the data, look at your theory, they don't match at all. Like, how could you have accepted this? How could you have thought this was a serious theory about this scientific question? Well, the answer is something like unknown knowns are making it look more plausible than it actually is. And I hope this should be a totally familiar idea to you now. Like we've been through this in a couple of different dimensions of how the framework that you bring to bear on the world can shape the things that you see in it without you being aware of it. And precisely what Lloyd's trying to do is to get these things to be not unknown knowns, but known knowns, things that you know, and then you're in a position to critique them and question them, right? the greater extent to which you can bring your ideological pre-commitments into the conscious world and have them explicitly formulated, the greater degree to which they are subject to, potentially subject to, transformative criticism. Right? So somebody else can bring their point of view to bear on it, and then you can have a serious conversation about what's true and what's false. And that's basically Lloyd's claim here. So, just as the kind of broad picture here, evolutionary explanation is tricky, I guess is the mild way of putting it. I hope that I didn't give you the impression that I would end this with like, and here's how you should live, and here's what the good life looks like. I have not been doing that. Really what I've been doing is giving other people's attempts to do that and saying, look how bad they are at it. So evolutionary explanation is extremely tricky. It's extremely complicated, and it's quite subject, I would say, to contextual values in the sense that we bring our social assumptions, our political assumptions, our ideologies with us when we go to interpret the world. I think that was the lesson of both this lecture and the lecture before. On the other hand, we can gain a little bit of insight about the sphere of possibilities available to us. So I can't tell you, on the basis of evolutionary theory, I don't think I've given you any reason to believe that we can say, here's how to live. Here's the one and only way that you should live your life. I don't think I've given you that at all. I hope I didn't give you the impression that I would, because you'll be disappointed. But what I hope to have shown you is that we can say with some confidence that the sphere of our possibilities is large. It is not constrained to just one way of being or living. So we're back to good old Sartre's thing about existence precedes essence. Like there's not one single type of being that genetics or evolution or our history affords us. There are lots. And so it's up to us to figure out where in that large space of possibilities we want to be. Okay. All right, so that's it for this. I failed to find a reading that I was really pleased with for the last class. I'll put up some optional readings, but so there's no required reading for this last class. We'll talk about science and free will. Okay.